If you play live cash games that offer button straddles, also known as Mississippi straddles, and you've ever wondered what the heck you should be playing in those hands because they're a little bit weird and exactly what ranges should you be playing preflop, stick around. You're in the right place. We're going to talk all about this today. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and today we're going to talk about button straddles, also known as Mississippi straddles. And in hands where this is active, you definitely have some differences in your overall preflop ranges, and if you've never really worked with preflop ranges before, especially GTO ranges, you might be a little surprised as to the differences when the straddle is on versus not. Alright, so just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's quickly define what a button straddle is in case you've heard of them but you're not 100% sure what they are. So this is when someone puts out 2 times the big blind before the cards are dealt. And in a button straddle, the button is the person who's putting out that 2 times the big blind. Action is going to begin on the small blind and it goes around from there. If there are any limps, then the button does have the option to raise. And the big thing to note is that when the straddle is on, it halves the effective stack of the game. So if you're playing a 2-5 game where everyone has $500, that's normally 100 big blinds. But when the straddle is on, that same $500 stack is actually only 50 big blinds effective. And the ranges we're going to talk about today come directly from the GTO solver. And this is very, very important because one, I believe this is the world first for a GTO solve of a button straddle pot. That is very, very important. And also I mentioned earlier that if there are limps, that the button does have the option to raise them, and in this solve the big blind does have the option to limp or complete in this spot. Nobody else can. The fact that there's a limp involved or included at all in the overall game tree is extremely unique, especially if you keep up with other offerings from other GTO solvers. So with all that said, what I want to do today is walk you through some of the ranges from this solve and also show you side-by-side comparisons to the original live GTO solve where the straddle is not active. I think this is very, very interesting, and some of the exploration that I've done through this kind of data that can be very, very helpful for digging out some of the bigger patterns that come from the solver overall, even though there is gobs and gobs of data to go through. So to find all of these ranges and follow along, you can download the GTO Ranges app from Red Chip Poker. Just look for it in your app store of choice, and let's fire up to the range. We can find this over in the full ring section, go to button straddle, and go from here. What I want to start with is the small blind open raising range, right? Because the button straddles, small blind is the first person to act, and I think it's always very important to understand when someone is first to act preflop, what is that range? That is an extremely important range to understand whether the straddle is on or off. If you're looking for preflop ranges, that is one of the first ranges you should be looking for. So to do this, we can simply click on the open for the small blind, and you notice that the range right this moment is 10.6% of hands, and most of it is unshockingly right up in that upper left hand corner. Essentially 10s plus is the full of it, ace jack plus, and then some other fun double Broadway stuff as well, a little bit in terms of the medium pocket pairs, 6s, 7s, and 8s, and because there is no open limping available for the small blind, it's either a raise these hands or fold. There's no mixing between raising or limping in this exact spot. Now what I think is helpful to do is to compare again the small blind RFI in the straddle solve compared to the regular solve and looking at under the gun, because again they would be the first person to act in a non-straddle pot. So if we do that and open up the under the gun from the live RGTO, their open raising range is 9.3% of hands. The overall formulation of hands is a little bit similar. You notice there's a little bit higher inclusion of things like A7 suited and A6 suited that aren't even in the button straddle ranges, and there's a little bit less inclusion of things like 7-6 suited and pocket 6s, but ultimately similar shape, although ace jack offsuit is curious. That's almost fully included when the straddle is on, but not included, or barely included I should say, when the straddle is off. But notice the effective stacks, right? Because we have the lower effective stack with the straddle on, we notice that the RFI range from the first person to act is higher, and not only is the RFI from the first person to act wider when the straddle is on, you notice that when you're doing that from the small blind, you have position on nobody if you end up getting action. Whereas from under the gun in the non-straddle solve, they would have position on 2 of the 7 remaining players. So that's very interesting. 14% boost in in the overall RFI range, even given some not so great circumstances, at least on the surface. Alright, the next spot I want to look at is the cutoff RFI. Again, one of the default ranges I tend to look at when I'm exploring a new solve or a new preflop range set. So in this situation, if we flick over to the cutoff, you notice that the overall range is roughly 41% of hands, and not super shocking in the overall shape and creation of it. All pocket pairs, everything ace-x suited, everything king-x suited, a lot of the double suited stuff included gappers and connectors, and ace-x offsuit down to roughly ace-4 off, around half of that. Now, if we go and compare that to the regular solve, again with no straddle on, and we look at the cutoff open raising range, we notice that that is only roughly 22% of hands, much tighter, not even full inclusion of pocket sixes. Yes, ace-x suited is all in there, but king-x much less of that, much less in terms of suited connectors and suited gappers, and this is obviously much tighter. And at first glance, it might seem like, wow, this is crazy. Why is it almost twice as high, the RFI from the cutoff, with the straddle on versus the straddle off? Well, we have to think about the formulation, because if the cutoff can RFI when the button straddle is on, it means that there is only a single person left to act, the button in this situation, who has 100% of hands right this moment, and they would have position on us if we ended up getting action from them, compared to the regular non-straddle solve, where if you RFI from the cutoff, there are 3 players to get through, one of them who would have position on you, and 2 that you would have position on. So it's not necessarily apples to apples. A better comparison instead might actually be thinking about the small blind RFI when the straddle is off, since that's a situation where, again, there's a single person left to act who has 100% of their hands right this moment, and if you get action, you would be out of position, and I think that's probably a little bit closer. So if we flick that over instead of the cutoff from the regular non-straddle solve, and instead go to the small blind, you notice that that range is 40.4%, so these are pretty much neck and neck and look almost exactly the same. Alright, now I want to look at a 3-bet range with you. So let's take a spot where the hijack open raises and the button is deciding to 3-bet. So if we look at that over here, flip this over to hijack open and button decides to 3-bet, notice that that range is 8.5% of hands. If we set up the exact same formulation over in the non-straddle solve where hijack opens and the button 3-bets, you notice that that is 6.1% of hands. However, what I find really interesting here is actually to look at the overall continuance range for the button in this situation, again facing an RFI from the hijack. So let's say that we're in the non-straddle solve, that overall continuance between calling and 3-betting is around 12%. However, if we're here in the straddle on and we look at the button, again 3-bet at 8.5 and the call at 30%. So roughly 39% of the time the button should be giving action against the hijack RFI. Now, whenever I see that kind of discrepancy, one of the first things I think of is, okay, well, what was the RFI range? Let's think about what the hijack would actually open raise with in that spot. And if we back up a tick, or actually we just click done right here in the app and it'll show you the entire decision. So the hijack open raise right now is roughly 27% of hands. Now, if you look at that exact same spot with the straddle off, it's only roughly 16% of hands. This is why context is so important, and in general why we don't want to take a single number and over extrapolate it. Even just a basic 3-bet number in this exact situation, or an overall continuance number by looking at buttons continuance against a hijack RFI when the straddle is on versus not on. Things like effective stacks, things like the overall game tree creation, things like what the original person was RFIing in the first place with, all impact things and are very important. So if you're looking at solves, again, this is why I like to do this kind of comparison, because it really helps you get bigger context and understanding the overall patterns that come up when the solver is doing preflop work. So while we could spend hours upon hours going through these ranges and pointing out things that are very interesting, I think at this point it's best to understand the overall context and understand that it's probably a good time for you to go check out the overall ranges yourself, spend some time with them, look at them, really understand those RFI numbers, understand those 3-bet numbers and squeeze numbers. I think you would definitely start to figure out the patterns quite quickly, especially when you compare them side by side between the straddle straddle on versus the straddle off. Again, you can look for the GTO Ranges app from Red Chip Poker, look for it in your app store of choice, or just go to redchippoker.com/app to get the download links from there. Unlock the entire app, explore the entire preflop range sets, and I think you're going to find some very interesting things too. Again, redchippoker.com/app to get started today. So I'm going to leave you right here with that. Hopefully you enjoy. If you have any comments or questions, do not hesitate to let me know. And if you want to see another solve, definitely make sure to check out the under the gun straddle solve that we did as well. I'll leave a link for that video right up there. I think you're really going to enjoy that, especially again if you play live cash games and you have a lot of these weird straddle pots. Definitely want to know these ranges. So enjoy that video. I'll see you back with another one shortly. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.